For decades, one question has followed Israel. Asked quietly, never answered. Does the country possess nuclear weapons? No confirmation. No denial. Only silence. In the late 1950s, deep in the Negev Desert, a facility rose behind layers of secrecy. Inspectors were shown prepared rooms. Maps were altered. Schedules controlled. And Dimona's true purpose remained unspoken. Intelligence agencies noticed. Allies grew uneasy. Yet no document, no speech, no admission ever appeared. This is not a conspiracy story. This is a story of strategy, where silence becomes deterrence and ambiguity itself becomes power. Silence is not the absence of sound. Sometimes it is a decision. For more than half a century, one question has followed Israel through wars, alliances, and crises, quietly, persistently, and without an official answer. Does Israel possess nuclear weapons? There has never been a confirmation. There has never been a denial. Only silence. In a world where nuclear powers announce themselves with tests, treaties, and declarations, Israel stands alone. The United States acknowledged its arsenal. The Soviet Union paraded its missiles through Red Square. Britain and France signed treaties and issued statements. Even emerging nuclear states eventually cross a line from secrecy to admission. Israel never did. This silence is not accidental. It is deliberate, calculated, and central to Israeli national security doctrine. To understand why, one must return to the country's earliest years, a time when survival itself was uncertain. Born in 1948, Israel emerged into a hostile region, surrounded by adversaries who openly questioned its right to exist. The memory of annihilation was not theoretical. It was fresh, personal, and seared into the minds of its leadership. For David Ben-Gurion, Israel's first prime minister, survival was not negotiable. He believed that conventional military strength alone would never be enough. Israel was small. Its population was limited. Its strategic depth was measured in minutes, not kilometers. One decisive defeat could mean the end of the state. And so, quietly, an idea took hold. Not a weapon, at least not yet, but an insurance policy. By the early 1950s, Israel had begun laying the intellectual and industrial groundwork for a capability that would never be spoken aloud. Scientists were sent abroad. Relationships were formed discreetly. Research institutions expanded under civilian titles. Budgets were hidden within other projects. Nothing publicly announced. Nothing officially denied. From the beginning, the power of the program was not meant to come from demonstration, but from uncertainty. Silence became a shield. By refusing to confirm anything, Israel denied its adversaries clarity. If Israel had the bomb, attacking it would risk unimaginable retaliation. If it did not, assuming otherwise would still restrain aggression. Ambiguity itself became deterrence. Foreign intelligence agencies noticed almost immediately. American analysts flagged unusual construction patterns. European diplomats asked cautious questions. Aerial reconnaissance hinted at facilities that did not align with civilian explanations. Yet every inquiry met the same response. Calm, polite, and empty. There was nothing to confirm. There was nothing to deny. This was not evasion. It was policy. In Washington, officials debated how to respond. Press too hard, and Israel might retreat further into secrecy. Push too little, and an entirely new nuclear power might emerge unmonitored in the Middle East. The result was a tense equilibrium. Questions asked quietly, answers given carefully, and no one forcing the issue into the open. Meanwhile, Israel's silence took on a second role: protection from political consequences. Admitting possession would invite sanctions, treaties, inspections, and international pressure. Denying it outright would invite scrutiny, verification, and eventual exposure. Silence avoided both. It allowed flexibility. It preserved strategic ambiguity. And it kept the initiative firmly in Israeli hands. What made the strategy so effective was discipline. Decade after decade, administrations changed. Wars came and went. Leaks surfaced and faded. Yet the policy held. No speeches. No tests. No confirmation. Not even when provoked. Not even when accused. Especially not then. By saying nothing, Israel forced the world to do the talking for it. Analysts speculated. Journalists investigated. intelligence agencies estimated. But speculation never becomes proof, and estimates never become admissions. The silence remained intact, unbroken, deliberate, and powerful. This is where the story begins. Not with an explosion, not with a weapon, but with the decision to never speak of it at all. Because in modern warfare, sometimes the most powerful weapon is what you refuse to say. In the late 1950s, something began to rise in the Negev Desert. From the air, it looked unremarkable. Concrete, scaffolding, barracks, a cluster of low, angular buildings surrounded by sand and isolation. Officially, it was a textile plant. Later, it became a manganese processing facility. At one point, it was described as a research center. The explanations changed. The location did not. The site was Dimona, a name that would never appear in public statements, but would quietly alarm every intelligence service capable of seeing it. Israel chose the Negev for a reason. Vast, sparsely populated, and easily controlled, the desert offered isolation without attention. There were no nearby cities to ask questions, no civilian traffic, no reason for outsiders to pass through. What happened there could remain unseen if it was managed carefully, and it was. Construction began in near total secrecy. Workers were brought in under strict compartmentalization. Many were told they were building an industrial plant. Others were informed they were working on infrastructure for national development. Very few understood the full scope of what was being assembled. They did not need to. Only a small inner circle knew the true purpose of the facility, and even they spoke in fragments. Titles were civilian. Documents were sanitized. Conversations avoided specifics. The project was buried inside layers of bureaucracy designed not just to obscure, but to confuse. Confusion was the point. Foreign intelligence agencies soon noticed that something was wrong. Two reconnaissance flights over Israel captured images of an expanding complex, unlike anything else in the region. The scale exceeded what would be required for civilian industry. The layout suggested containment zones, heavy shielding, and underground construction. These were not the features of a textile factory. Washington asked questions. Israeli officials answered calmly and falsely. They insisted the site was peaceful, non-military, unrelated to weapons. They invited American inspectors, but under conditions carefully controlled. Inspections were scheduled. Routes were predetermined. Entire sections were sealed off or temporarily repurposed. Walls were built not just to contain, but to hide. In some cases, false control rooms were constructed. Elevators were disabled. Corridors ended abruptly. Inspectors were guided through a version of Dimona designed specifically for them. What they were allowed to see was accurate, but incomplete. What they were not allowed to see was everything that mattered. Even more striking was the level of cooperation required to maintain the illusion. Construction schedules were adjusted to inspection calendars. Equipment was moved. Operations paused. Workers rehearsed answers to questions they did not fully understand. Everyone played a role, often without knowing they were part of deception. This was not improvisation. It was choreography. France's role, though never fully acknowledged, became increasingly difficult to ignore. Technical expertise appeared where Israel lacked experience. Reactor components matched French designs. Training programs quietly overlapped. The partnership was discreet, transactional, and temporary, but critical. And when France withdrew, the project did not stop. By then, it no longer needed to. Underground, Dimona grew deeper. Literally, subterranean levels were added beneath the visible facility. Layers of reinforced concrete designed to contain radiation, machinery, and secrecy. From the surface, the site appeared stable. Below it, a different structure existed entirely. A structure that did not officially exist. Even Israeli military commanders were not fully briefed. The project was kept separate from conventional forces, governed by a chain of command that answered to the highest political authority, and no one else. This separation was intentional. If exposed, the program would not implicate the military. If denied, it would not contradict public doctrine. If discovered, responsibility would be diffuse, ambiguous, and difficult to assign. By the mid-1960s, Dimona had become more than a facility. It had become a test, not of technology, but of control. Could a modern state build something transformative in full view of global intelligence and still keep it officially non-existent? The answer, at least for a time, was yes, because the deception was not about lying convincingly. It was about never being forced to tell the truth. And Dimona remained what Israel intended it to be, a place everyone suspected, a facility no one could confirm, a reality protected by silence, denial, and careful misdirection. For decades, Dimona survived on ambiguity. Analysts suspected, governments inferred, intelligence agencies whispered. But nothing concrete ever surfaced, no documents, no images, no first-hand confirmation that could not be denied, until one man decided to speak. His name was Mordechai Vanunu. In the mid-1980s, Vanunu was not a general, a politician, or a spy. He was a technician, quiet, observant, and deeply ordinary. He worked inside Dimona, not at the surface facilities shown to inspectors, but in the restricted interior, where routine maintenance brushed against classified systems. He was not given the full picture. He did not need it. The fragments were enough. Over time, Vanunu noticed patterns that could not be explained by civilian research. Equipment inconsistent with energy production. Safety protocols designed for far more dangerous materials. Structural layouts that suggested containment, separation, and scale far beyond any peaceful program Israel had ever acknowledged. Most telling of all was what could not be discussed. Certain rooms were never referenced. Certain processes were unnamed. Entire sections of the facility existed in silence, known only to those who worked there, never spoken of outside. The secrecy was not casual. It was absolute, and it weighed on him. By his own later accounts, Vanunu became increasingly disturbed, not by the technology itself, but by the idea that such power could exist without public consent, without acknowledgement, without accountability. He was not reacting to a single moment, but to an accumulation of understanding. So he did something unprecedented. He documented it. Using a small camera, Vanunu photographed the interior of Dimona. Carefully, deliberately, over time, the images captured equipment layouts, containment structures, and technical components that experts would later analyze with shock. These were not vague snapshots. They were systematic. They were proof. In 1986, Vanunu left Israel and traveled to Europe. There, he approached journalists, eventually connecting with the Sunday Times in London. The paper did not publish immediately. Instead, they consulted nuclear experts, scientists who had spent careers studying reactor design and weapons production. Their conclusion was devastating. The images indicated not just a reactor, but a full-scale nuclear weapons program, one capable of producing plutonium in quantities far exceeding Israel's stated needs, one that suggested a stockpile measured not in possibility, but in numbers. For the first time, Israel's policy of ambiguity was at risk of collapse. The response was swift and silent. Before the story could break, Israeli intelligence moved. Vanunu was lured from London to Rome under false pretenses. There, he was drugged, abducted, and transported back to Israel in total secrecy. The operation was never officially acknowledged, but the outcome was undeniable. Vanunu vanished. When the story finally broke, it did so without its central figure. The photographs were published. The analysis was printed. The world reacted with stunned restraint. Governments avoided confrontation. Allies deflected. Israel denied nothing and admitted nothing. Vanunu, meanwhile, stood trial behind closed doors. He was convicted of treason and espionage and sentenced to 18 years in prison, much of it spent in solitary confinement. Even after his release, he remained under strict restrictions, unable to leave the country, unable to speak freely to foreign media. The message was unmistakable. Silence would be enforced. Yet the damage was done. From that moment on, Dimona could no longer be dismissed as speculation. The conversation shifted. Intelligence estimates hardened. Strategic calculations changed. Israel's neighbors adjusted their assumptions, even if they never acknowledged them publicly. But something else happened too. Despite the evidence, despite the photographs, despite the expert analysis, nothing officially changed. No confirmation, no declaration, no treaty signature. Israel's doctrine held. The world now knew, but could not say it knew. This was the paradox Vanunu had exposed. Not a secret hidden in darkness, but a truth suspended in plain sight, unable to be spoken without consequences. The revelation did not dismantle ambiguity. It reinforced it, because the power of Dimona was never in the weapon itself. It was in the uncertainty surrounding it. By the late 1980s, the truth about Dimona had surfaced, yet nothing was acknowledged. No press conference, no admission, no denial. Instead, Israel doubled down on a strategy unlike any other nuclear power in history: deliberate, disciplined ambiguity. It was not an accident. It was doctrine. While the United States paraded its arsenal and the Soviet Union measured deterrence in megatons and missile counts, Israel chose a different path. It would neither confirm nor deny possession of nuclear weapons. It would sign no declarations. It would invite no inspectors beyond carefully controlled limits. The message was subtle, but unmistakable. Assume what you must. Act accordingly. This policy, later described by analysts as strategic opacity, served multiple purposes at once. To Israel's enemies, it created fear without provocation. To its allies, it avoided political confrontation. And to the international community, it offered plausible deniability, an uncomfortable but convenient silence. The brilliance of the doctrine lay in its restraint. Israel never threatened nuclear use, never tested a weapon publicly, never deployed missiles in parades. There were no speeches about ultimate power, no chest-thumping demonstrations. Instead, deterrence was achieved through calculated absence. A presence felt precisely because it was never displayed. In military terms, this was revolutionary. Traditional nuclear deterrence relied on visibility. Missiles in silos, bombers on runways, submarines patrolling oceans. Israel's deterrence relied on psychology. Every adversary had a plan for a scenario that officially did not exist, but could not be ignored. Arab military planners faced a nightmare of uncertainty. If Israel had nuclear weapons, how many? Where were they stored? Under what conditions would they be used? No doctrine answered these questions. No red lines were published. There was no manual to study, no precedent to analyze. Any major conventional war carried an unspoken risk, one that could not be calculated or contained. This uncertainty reshaped regional behavior. Full-scale invasions became riskier. Escalation became unpredictable. Wars shifted toward limited engagements, proxy conflicts, and indirect confrontation. Even at moments of extreme tension, such as the Yom Kippur War, nuclear ambiguity hovered like a shadow, influencing decisions on all sides. Behind the scenes, the doctrine was carefully maintained. Israeli officials were trained never to speak directly about Dimona's true purpose. Language was controlled. Statements were rehearsed. Even leaks were managed with extraordinary discipline. The silence was not passive. It was actively enforced, institutionally preserved. And it worked. The United States, aware of the program but unwilling to provoke regional instability, accepted the ambiguity. Intelligence agencies adjusted estimates quietly. International institutions looked elsewhere. The Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty remained unsigned by Israel, yet the issue never escalated into open confrontation. Dimona existed in a diplomatic blind spot, acknowledged privately, ignored publicly. What made the doctrine so powerful was not just what it concealed, but what it prevented. By refusing to declare itself a nuclear power, Israel avoided triggering arms races that formal acknowledgement might have accelerated. No official declaration meant fewer justifications for neighboring states to openly pursue their own programs. Ambiguity froze a strategic landscape, but it also came with risks. Without declared red lines, miscalculation was always possible. Adversaries could push too far or hesitate too long. Crisis management relied on signals, back channels, and assumptions rather than clear rules. The margin for error was narrow, and the stakes were absolute. Yet Israeli planners accepted this risk. From their perspective, certainty was dangerous. Predictability invited challenge. Ambiguity kept opponents guessing and caution alive. Dimona, therefore, was not merely a facility. It was a psychological weapon, one that reshaped deterrence without ever revealing its full shape, one that proved power did not need to be seen to be effective, one that operated entirely in the space between knowledge and denial. And in Part 5, we'll examine the most dangerous question of all: what happens when ambiguity is tested? Because silence works, until someone decides to break it. Ambiguity works, until history applies pressure. For Israel's nuclear doctrine, that pressure came not from diplomats or journalists, but from war itself. October 1973, the Yom Kippur War. On the holiest day of the Jewish calendar, Egyptian and Syrian forces launched a coordinated surprise assault. Israeli defenses buckled. Forward positions collapsed. Casualties mounted. For the first time since the state's founding, defeat felt possible, not theoretical, but real. Inside Israeli command centers, panic was tightly contained, but unmistakable. Ammunition ran low. Aircraft were lost faster than they could be replaced. Enemy armor pushed deeper with every hour. Behind closed doors, Israel's leadership confronted a question that had never been meant to surface. What if ambiguity is not enough? For decades, Dimona had existed to prevent this moment. Now, the moment had arrived. Declassified materials and later testimonies suggest that Israel quietly initiated precautionary measures. Not deployment, not threats, but preparation. Aircraft were placed on heightened readiness. Specialized units were alerted. Signals, subtle but intentional, were allowed to reach the right ears. No announcement was made. No weapon was displayed. No order was given. But the message traveled. Across the Atlantic, American intelligence took notice. Satellite imagery shifted. Communications patterns changed. Washington understood immediately what Tel Aviv was signaling, not through words, but through posture. The result was one of the fastest strategic responses in modern history. The United States launched a massive resupply effort, Operation Nickelgrass, airlifting weapons, ammunition, and equipment directly into Israel. The balance of the war began to shift within days. The nuclear option was never used, but its possibility had spoken louder than any ultimatum. For Israeli planners, the lesson was chilling and clarifying. Ambiguity had worked, but only barely. The war ended in a ceasefire, borders stabilized, and the immediate crisis passed. Yet something fundamental had changed. Dimona was no longer just a long-term deterrent. It had become an emergency backstop, a final guarantee of survival when conventional power failed. From that point forward, Israel refined its unspoken doctrine: not never use, not first use, but last survival. The nuclear arsenal, still officially non-existent, was understood internally as a safeguard against annihilation, not a tool of coercion. Its purpose was not victory, but continuity. Not dominance, but existence. This restraint was deliberate. Israeli leadership recognized that crossing the nuclear threshold would not merely end a war. It would redefine Israel forever. Diplomatic isolation, regional escalation, moral consequences that could not be undone. Silence, therefore, remained preferable. But ambiguity had now acquired weight. Throughout the decades that followed, regional conflicts flared again and again: Lebanon, Gaza, missile standoffs, proxy wars. But the shadow of Dimona lingered quietly behind every escalation. Adversaries learned to test boundaries without crossing invisible lines. Israel responded with precision, not excess. The bomb remained unspoken, but always implied. Then came 1986. Mordechai Vanunu, a former technician at Dimona, leaked photographs and technical details to the British press. For the first time, the world saw tangible evidence of what had long been assumed: reactors, reprocessing facilities, weapons-grade material. The response was immediate and absolute. Vanunu was silenced. Israel issued no confirmation, no correction, no clarification. Silence held. And remarkably, it still worked. International outrage flared, then faded. Governments adjusted their assessments quietly. The doctrine survived its most dangerous exposure intact. Not because the truth was unknown, but because acknowledging it served no one's interests. By the end of the Cold War, Israel had achieved something unprecedented: a nuclear deterrent with no declaration, No tests, no doctrine, no signature. A weapon system defined entirely by implication. And in Part 6, we'll confront the final question. What is the true legacy of Dimona? Because its greatest impact may not be what it protected, but what it permanently changed about how nations think about power, secrecy, and survival. Dimona was never meant to be seen. Not as a triumph, not as a threat, not even as a warning. Its purpose was far more profound and far more unsettling. By the late 20th century, Israel had accomplished something no other nation ever had. It reshaped deterrence without declaring it. While nuclear powers announced tests, paraded missiles, and published doctrines, Israel chose absence. No confirmation, no denial, only continuity. And that choice changed the rules of power. Dimona did not end wars. It prevented certain wars from ever being imagined. In the decades following the Yom Kippur War, every regional actor adjusted their calculations, quietly. Military planners in Cairo, Damascus, Baghdad, and Tehran never planned openly for nuclear confrontation with Israel. They didn't need proof. The uncertainty itself was enough. In strategic terms, ambiguity became an invisible wall. The genius of the system was restraint. Israel never used its presumed arsenal to coerce neighbors, extract concessions, or posture for prestige. There were no nuclear ultimatums, no public threats, no demonstrations of capability. The weapon existed only as a final boundary, one that could not be crossed without consequences no one wished to define. This restraint preserved something critical: legitimacy. Had Israel tested a weapon, declared a stockpile, or integrated nuclear arms into its public doctrine, it would have triggered immediate sanctions, isolation, and possibly regional proliferation. Instead, ambiguity allowed allies to look away, adversaries to hesitate, and diplomacy to function without collapse. Silence became policy. Dimona also forced a transformation in intelligence culture. Analysts around the world learned a new lesson. Power does not always announce itself. Sometimes the most decisive capabilities are those never confirmed, never denied, and never displayed. This realization rippled outward. Other nations studied the model, not to replicate exactly, but to understand its implications. Deterrence no longer required spectacle. Credibility could be constructed through consistency, secrecy, and disciplined silence. Yet Dimona's legacy is not purely strategic. It is moral. The reactor in the Negev was built in the shadow of genocide. Its logic was shaped by memory, trauma, and a collective refusal to ever again rely on external guarantees. For Israel's leaders, the question was never whether nuclear weapons were ethical in abstraction. It was whether national extinction was acceptable under any circumstances. Their answer was final. But that decision came with a cost. A permanent tension between transparency and survival, between international norms and existential fear, between silence and truth. Dimona demanded absolute control, not only of technology but of narrative. Leaks were treated as threats. Questions were deflected. Even allies were kept at arm's length. The program required discipline across generations, a shared understanding that some truths could never be spoken aloud. And astonishingly, it held. No internal collapse, no accidental exposure, no public reckoning. By the 21st century, Dimona had faded into the background, not because it no longer mattered, but because it had succeeded completely. It no longer needed to act. Its presence was embedded in every strategic assumption. The ultimate paradox is this: Israel's most powerful weapon shaped history without ever being used, tested, or acknowledged. It existed entirely in the realm of belief. Today, when analysts discuss modern deterrence, cyber warfare, artificial intelligence, autonomous weapons, they echo lessons first proven in the Negev Desert. That the future of power may lie not in visibility, but in uncertainty, not in dominance, but in denial. Dimona was not a bomb. It was a philosophy, one forged in secrecy, sustained by restraint, and preserved by silence. And that may be its most enduring legacy. Not the weapons it may have produced, but the precedent it set, that sometimes the most decisive force in history is the one the world is never allowed to see.